Good evening, and welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens podcast. Tonight we're diving into one of the most important and least honestly discussed geopolitical realities in modern world. Venezuela, oil, and the real impact of the United States involvement. This is not simply a story about petroleum sanctions or foreign policy. It is a story about how geography, energy dependency, global finances, and strategic control can determine whether the nation rises or collapses. Venezuela sits on the largest proven crude oil reserves on Earth, with more than over 300 billion barrels of oil beneath the soil, much of it concentrated in the massive Orinoco Belt. On paper, this should make Venezuela one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps even one of the strongest energy powers in the world. Yet instead of Venezuela, which has become a symbol of economic collapse, hyperinflation, and infrastructure decay, blackouts, migration crises, and a population trapped in a permanent instability. This contradictions is what makes Venezuela one of the most important case studies in modern geopolitics. How can a nation with the largest oil reserves in the world experience such deep poverty and state collapse? The answer that oil alone does not create the power, control over the systems surrounding the oil which creates the power. People often think about the oil and simply something that comes out of the ground and it gets sold for money, but that is dangerously an incomplete picture. Oil is not wealth by itself. It is valuable when it can be extracted and upgraded and transported and insured, redefined, and then sold and converted into a stable revenue. If any part of that chain is broken, the reserve becomes more of a political burden than an economic blessing. Venezuela's oil is not simply oil like the light, sweet crude often associated with Americans' shale production or Middle Eastern fields. Much of Venezuela's revenues are extra heavy crude, this thick, sulfur rich, expensive to process kind of deal, and it's heavily dependent on specialized refineries and imported dilutants to become usable. This means that Venezuela cannot simply um, rely on the industrial systems and international partnerships just to make the reserves economically functional. Or it must rely on the complex industrial systems and the international partnerships to make it, functional. My bad on that. It's the reverse of what I said. The dependence creates a vulnerability, and the vulnerability creates a leverage for outside powers. And this is where the United States enters the picture, not necessarily through military occupation, but through something far more effective like sanctions, refinery dependence, maritime enforcement, debt systems, and selective or corporate access. In many ways, Washington does not need to own Venezuelan oil to shape who profits from it and when. The most important misconception is public conversation. It is the phrase, America wants Venezuela oil. That phrase is too simple and it often misses the real mechanisms of control. The modern form of geopolitical influence is not a direct seizure, it is managed access through legal and financial architecture. The United States Treasury, through the Office of the Foreign Assistant Control of the OFAC, can effectively determine who is allowed to buy Venezuelan oil, who can insure the ships carrying it, and who can provide the equipment, who can legally refine it, and who can process the payments for those transactions. That means sanctions are not just punishment; They are a system of market allocation, and they decide with barrels like each barrel's reach the global market and with which barrels remain politically stranded. If that makes sense to you. Now, this transforms sanctions from a moral policy into a strategic infrastructure tool. It is not simply about punishing a government for the authoritarianism or corruption. It is about controlling the pace and the destination and the beneficiaries of the oil production. In effect, sanctions become a way of governing supply chains without physically occupying that actual territory. To understand how Venezuela has reached that point, we have to examine the PDVSA, the state-owned oil company that once stood as one of the most powerful national oil companies in the world. The PDVSA was not just an oil producer, it was a financial heart of the Venezuelan state. It funded the social programs, the political patronage, the loyalty from the military, debt and payments, and the national budget itself. However, the oil became the state, and the state became dependent on the oil. This created a fatal contradiction because the PDVSA was expected to function as both the competitive international energy company as well as the national treasury for the political survival. And those two missions are fundamentally incompatible over the long term. Now, instead of reinvesting the profits in maintenance and modernization and technical development, increasing portions of the oil revenue were redirected into political stabilization and the short-term governance. The skilled engineers and the technical staff were pushed out through politicization, while the corruption and underinvestment hollowed the system from within, and the infrastructure began to decay. It decayed faster than it could be repaired. Pipelines deteriorated, the refineries became unreliable, the electric systems also collapsed, and even production began a long downward spiral. Venezuela once produced well over 3 million barrels of oil per day during stronger historical periods. But by the 2020s and in 2026 specifically, production remained closer to around 1 million barrels per day, or less depending on operational conditions. The world's largest reserves were sitting underground while the machinery needed to extract them was failing above the ground. This is one of the most important truths about energy, politics, reserves, which are not the same as capacity. The real reserve is not just underground, crude, it is infrastructure, engineering, labor, financing, and in the industrial competence. And once those systems break, geological wealth means very little. At the same time, the United States recognized something strategically important. Venezuela collapse did not eliminate the importance of its oil. In fact, its scarcity made control even more valuable. The U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are heavily optimized for the heavy, sour crude and the exact type of oil Venezuela actually produces. The American shale and oil is often lighter and does not perfectly substitute for Venezuelan heavy crude. In these refinery systems, which creates structural demand, meaning Venezuela remains strategically important even during sanctions and diplomatic hostilities. The relationship becomes one of the constrained necessities rather than open cooperation with the country. And this is where the Chevron becomes one of the most important geopolitical actors in this story. Chevron is not simply an oil company operating overseas. It functions as a strategic hinge between Washington and Caracas. Through special licensing arrangements, Chevron has been allowed to maintain and expand their operations even while broader sanctions remain in place. This exception is not accidental. Chevron allows the United States to preserve the access to critical heavy crude supplies while maintaining broader political pressure on the Venezuelan government itself, and it creates a form of the reversible diplomacy where Washington can tighten or loosen the pressure without fully lifting the sanctions. Chevron also provides something even more important, which is controlled revenue channels under the licensing frameworks. Operations can continue while limiting the unrestricted cash flow to the Venezuelan state. And this means that the oil production can rise without granting total financial freedom to the regime. This is one of the dearest examples of modern geopolitical management. America does not necessarily need immediate regime change if it can shape the output, the market access, and the revenue distribution through selective corporate permissions. This is often more stable and more effective than open confrontation. The Orinoco Belt itself represents the core contradiction of Venezuelan sovereignty. The state insists on the majority of ownership and national control over the strategic resources, but extracting the oil often requires the foreign technology, foreign capital, and foreign logistics, as well as foreign legal protection. This creates a permanent tension between the legal ownership and operational control. Recent agreements involving Chevron and other international actors demonstrate that clearly expanding the operational stakes and restructuring the production zones and selective investment all show that the Venezuela cannot fully revive itself or can't revive the output with negotiated dependency on its foreign capabilities. This is not like a classic privatization. It is strategic and interdependence shaped by the political risk. Another major factor often ignored in mainstream discussion is the sovereign debt. Venezuela and the PDVSA carry enormous debt burdens estimated in the range of about $150 to $170 billion, depending on the structure of the claims, arbitration, awards, and obligations. That means future oil revenue is already politically spoken for before a single new barrel is sold. The bondholders and foreign governments expropriate corporations, arbitration courts, Chinese financing arrangements with Russian strategic interest in U.S. legal claims. They're all competing for the future revenue streams, and the oil is collateral before it becomes development and capital. This turns reconstruction into a battle over payment, priority, and rather than national renewal. Many people assume that if Venezuela simply increases their production, the country will recover. But the increased production does not automatically translate into improved living conditions or ordinary citizens. If new revenue is absorbed by the debt servicing, elite protection, sanctions compliance, and emergency state survival, little reaches the hospitals or the roads or the schools or the power grid. This is a true cruelty at the extraction, like the extraction state. Production becomes a circular system where the nation produces the oil to survive politically, and it survives politically only to continue producing the oil, and the development becomes secondary to their continuity. This is why ordinary Venezuelans can remain trapped in poverty while the country possesses extraordinary natural resources and wealth. Oil wealth under these conditions becomes less of a blessing and more of a mechanism for administrative containment. The resources curse is not just economic, it's institutional. Maritime geography also plays a major role in the system's oil, and it is not sold when it is pumped from the ground. It is sold when it is successfully reaches its buyer. The tankers, shipping insurance, port access, ship tracking, and the transshipment routes, they all become the real battleground of enforcement. The Caribbean basin functioned as a strategic environment zone where U.S. financial influence and maritime visibility matters enormously, not only for the country but for the people itself. And even if Venezuela increases their production, it must still move through systems shaped by the international compliance rules, insurance restrictions, and the secondary sanctions pressure. Control of shipping can matter more than the control of the wells. And this is why the sovereignty, it narrows as the oil moves outward from the wellhead. A nation may own the crude underground, but if it cannot move it freely through the global systems that they have, that ownership becomes, conditional. Geography becomes weaponized through logistics. And another overlooked factor is migration pressure. The United States is not only concerned with the oil revenues or the ideological competition itself, it's also deeply concerned with the regional stability. Venezuelan economic collapse created one of the largest migration crises in the Western Hemisphere, while affecting Colombia, Brazil, Central America, and eventually the United States itself. The energy policy and migration policy became linked. Washington prefers enough economic stabilization to reduce the migration surges with necessary granting the full unrestricted recovery to the Venezuelan state. Now, this creates a delicate balance act between the pressure and the controlled relief. Excuse me. China and Russia also complicate the question. Both countries have strategic and financial interests tied to Venezuela, whether it's through loans, military cooperation, debt structures, or geopolitical positioning against U.S. influence. American policy is not only about the carcass, it is about limiting external rivals from covering Venezuelan instability into strategic footholds. And just a reminder, Caracas is the city of Venezuela. I just want you to be aware of that. That's what I meant by Caracas. This is why the sanctions often tighten and loosen, like cyclically, if you know what I'm saying. Like instead of following a straight ideological path, it is a collaboration, not a contradiction. Washington seeks managed access without uncontrolled sovereignty. The goal is not simply to take the oil, as political slogans often suggest. The real objective is to stable output, controlled market access, and reduce Chinese leverage, manageable migration flows, energy security for the American refinery systems, and the financial visibility over the revenue channels. This is far more sophisticated than old-fashioned conquest. This also explains why policy shifts can appear inconsistent. To the public, one administration may talk aggressively about democracy while still allowing the selective oil licensing, while another may tighten the sanctions while quietly preserving the corporate exceptions. The contradiction is often strategic rather than accidental. For the ordinary Venezuelans, however, these distinctions matter little when daily life is defined by shortages, inflation, unreliable electricity, and instability and decay. Geopolitical collaboration does not fix a hospital with medicine or a city without stable water access. Strategy at the top often looks like a stagnation on the ground. The tragedy is that Venezuelan people are often treated as variables inside larger strategic equations. Oil output, sanctions compliance, migration flows, and regional influence become the language of the policy. While social reconstruction remains delayed, the top population remains in form of permanent awakening. Or permanent waiting, I'm sorry. This is why the Venezuela cannot be understood purely through the ideology. It is not enough to say socialism failed, capitalism interfered, or foreign powers manipulated the outcomes. Through the elements, all three are present. The deeper truth is that the oil became the structure through which the power itself was administered. Once that happens, everything else becomes subordinate. To extraction politics, institutions exist to protect the revenue, not necessarily to build public trust. The economic policy becomes a security policy, and sovereignty becomes conditional on who controls the access in the markets. Venezuela's decaying infrastructure proves that better than any academic theory. The world's largest reserves have not produced national security because the reserves without systems are not power. They are leverage for others. The United States understands this deeply. It does not need to physically occupy oil fields when sanctions, shipping restrictions, refinery dependence, and corporate licensing can achieve strategic influence at lower cost and lower political risk. Modern empire often operates through the permissions, not flags. This is why Chevron matters. Why OFAC matters. Why Gulf Coast refinery configurations matter. And why the maritime insurance can shape your national destiny. These are not technical details, they are the architecture of geopolitical control, and the map matters because the infrastructure matters. For Venezuela to truly recover, production alone is not enough. The country would need institutional rebuilding, debt restructuring, infrastructure reinvestment, and technical restoration, and a revenue system that serves national development instead of political survival. Without that, higher output simply feeds the same broken machine. The reconstruction is extraordinarily difficult because every major actor has competing incentives. Domestic elites want survival, foreign creditors want repayment, rival powers want leverage, and energy markets want reliable supply. The interests of the population are often the least institutionally protected, and this creates the enduring paradox. A nation rich enough to transform an entire continent remains trapped in an economic paralysis, not because the oil is missing, but because the systems governing the oil are designed around the control rather than recovery. Geography becomes destiny with institutions fail. So when people ask whether America is involved in Venezuela because of the oil, the honest answer is yes, but not in the simplistic way many imagine. It is not just about stealing resources. It is about shaping the access and controlling risk, managing the strategic competitors, and ensuring that the energy flows remain aligned with broader U.S. interests. This distinction matters because it explains why policy rarely looks clean or moral. It is not simply humanitarian concerns or simply greed. It is strategic management of dependency. Venezuela is both a warning and a blueprint for how modern power operates. In the end, Venezuela is not poor despite the oil. It is trapped because oil became the foundation of how power and debt and survival were organized. The United States influences that system not mainly through invasion, but through licensing, sanctions, refineries, finance, and controlled exceptions. This is the real geopolitics of oil. And until the infrastructure governance and the sovereign revenue distributions are rebuilt, not just extraction volumes, the largest proven reserves on Earth will remain a geopolitical asset for others before they become a path to national recovery for Venezuela themselves. The barrels exist, but power lies in who controls the route from the well to the world. This is the truth behind Venezuela's oil paradox. This is the reality behind sanctions and selective access, and that is why the story of Venezuela is not only about one nation, it is about the modern world and how they decides who gets to convert the natural wealth into an actual sovereignty. Thank you for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens. If you found this deep dive valuable, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing you the stories behind the headlines and the truth behind the politics. Stay informed and stay critical, and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.